Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Nuno, for being here today, and thank you for your wonderful data. I, too, had a question on the consumer spending side. Several of my colleagues have asked those questions, and you've answered them. You know, when you look at on the ride down here this morning, we talked, I listened to a national radio show talking about business and the worldwide economy and the risks that are associated with that national risk that's out there today, basically the unpredictability of oil and governments and what have you. You know, when you look at Pennsylvania, however, it's a brighter picture. You look at the job growth, the job gains, you look at lower energy costs, and I'm looking at page 3 of your analysis where you talk about the Pennsylvania consumer, and it's a 10-year historical data. We looked at and see that their spending on auto loans have increased 10% for the last 2 years. We look at personal and other debt has increased. So it looks like our consumers are employed, they're saving money on their energy costs, and they're spending it. But then when you look at consumer expenditures on goods, there's like no growth. I mean, could you explain that? I mean, are people, how can they be increasing their debt on auto loans but not buying autos, I guess is my question.
Yeah, the paradox there, as you note, the goods are not growing as fast as the services. Part of that this year, it was the low inflation and was only hitting goods. So they might be buying more goods, but the price across all of them is actually falling, whereas for services such as healthcare, it continues to increase. So that's part of the underlying dynamic here.
So it's not to say they're not buying more goods. It has to do with where their dollars are being spent.
Yeah, the allocation of the dollars and how fast the prices are increasing.
Okay. Staying within my 5 minutes, I know you've talked about this a little bit too. On page 2 of your testimony, you talk about long-term budget outlook. And you talk about, I guess I'm asking you where your starting point is my first question. But then you talk about adjustments that are made, and we just heard the gentleman talk about Plan Con, and we just talk about changes in reimbursements, offsetting some growth projections. But your last sentence talks about the report found that the residual shortfall of roughly $300 million. So where is that shortfall, $300 million? Are we talking, I guess, where is the starting point, and where do you end at that $300 million?
Well, the $300 million is the balance after we take over the carryover from last year, and we have some lapses.
Where is that? What budget are we using? Are we using a budget that was passed by the House and the Senate that was blue-lined by the governor, and are we including the expenditures that were blue-lined, that weren't blue-lined? Maybe just help me out there a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. For the purpose of our report, we did mainly rely on 1460. Items that were blue-lined, we assumed that they would be at that level at 1460. There are some exceptions to that where we used the framework agreement prior, but that's relatively minor. Most of it is based on 1460.
So all last year we heard about the $1 billion of shortfalls and structural deficits, $2 billion, 2.5, 1.2, $1.4 billion, and at the end of the day, we have a $300 million shortfall. I guess my question is this: do you think that we would need a $2.5 billion tax increase if at the end of the day we only had a $300 million shortfall? I mean, you're a very smart man. Do you think you would vote for that tax increase?
I can't. I have to defer comment on that.
Okay, so the first budget that the governor introduced, there were no votes for that. No votes. There were no votes for the governor's first budget last year because most people were smart enough to realize that they didn't want to vote for $2.5 billion in taxes when in fact our shortfall at the end of the day was $300 million. My other point is this: the gentleman very, explained that he really didn't agree with the Plan Con process and what we were doing there. I completely disagree. Plan Con, we had promised all these schools substantial amounts of money that were promised to them, capital expenditures that we were going to pay off to them over time. I think there's nothing better to do than to leverage that money, pay our schools, and pay it off over time because they are capital in nature. They're not repairs and maintenance. We're talking capital, buildings, large investments. So I disagree there. And the gentlelady talked about the Ridge administration increasing human benefits, and they did. The pension was 120% funded. But the administration for the 8 years afterwards forgot about pension payments. Just forgot about those payments. So they're telling us that we're mortgaging our children For 8 years, that administration forgot that they had a pension obligation to meet. Even when we had surpluses of hundreds of millions of dollars, we could not put them in the pension, and we couldn't even put the federal stimulus money in the pension. So it's a little disingenuous to hear today that they're all worried about our children when for 8 years they didn't even fund their employees of this Commonwealth. Do you have any comment on that?
No.
You don't have to answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.